My son was standing on the sidewalk in the dark with his 3-year-old daughter asleep against his shoulder when I pulled up. 2 duffel bags at his feet, a single box of books. That was everything 8 years of his life had become by 5:45 on a Tuesday morning in October. He didn't look up when my headlights swept over him. He just stood there the way a man stands when the last of his dignity is the only thing he has left to hold on to, and he's holding it by a thread. I turned off the engine. I sat for a moment in the quiet car, watching my son through the windshield. And I want to be honest with you right now. Before anything else I had known this morning was coming for 14 months. I had planned for it, prepared for it, built something in the dark specifically for it. But no amount of preparation on earth could have readied me for that image. My son. His little girl pressed against his neck. The porch light of the house he'd lived in for 6 years burning behind him like it belonged to a stranger. He still hadn't seen me. He didn't know I was there. He had no idea how long I'd been waiting. And the man inside that house, the man who had arranged every piece of this moment with the patience of someone who had never once been told no, had just made the most expensive mistake of his life. My name is Gerald Okafor. I'm 65 years old. I spent 31 years as a civil engineer for the city of Atlanta, and I raised my son Marcus alone from the time he was 14, after his mother Pauline died of a stroke that came on a Wednesday afternoon with no warning at all. I'm telling you that so you understand what Marcus and I are to each other. We are not a loud family, we don't perform, we show up. Marcus grew up to be the kind of man who apologizes when he's wrong, even when it costs him something, and who can make a room feel calmer just by walking into it. He taught 10th grade history at a public school in East Atlanta for 7 years. Good salary? No. Worth doing? Every single day he was there. He didn't fall in love with money. He fell in love with a woman named Simone Belcourt. And I still believe, even now, that the love between them was real. She laughed with her whole body. She remembered birthdays and middle names and what you said you were afraid of 3 years ago. She asked questions and meant them. Simone is not the villain of this story. Hold on to that. It matters more than you know. Her father is a man named Douglas Belcourt. If you've lived in the greater Atlanta area for any length of time, you've seen that name. 2 office towers in Midtown, a chain of car dealerships out on 285. Charitable donations with brass plaques on them. Douglas Belcourt is the kind of man who walks into a room and waits for the room to adjust to him, because in his experience, it always does. The first time I shook his hand at a dinner Marcus brought us all to, down in Buckhead, I felt it immediately. That particular stillness that belongs to men who have never once had to wonder whether they'd be heard. He didn't say anything offensive that night. He didn't need to. He stood in my foyer. Marcus had hosted us at his apartment and let his eyes move around the room the way an appraiser's do. Not rude, not even quite deliberate, just measuring. He called my son's bookshelves impressive in a tone that meant something slightly different. He complimented Marcus's cooking with a quarter-second pause that managed to make generosity sound like charity. When they left, Simone hugged Marcus long and warm. Douglas shook my hand again and said he looked forward to getting to know us better. I drove home that night with a cold feeling in my chest that I hadn't felt in 30 years of engineering, the specific discomfort of looking at a structure and knowing, before the calculations are even run, that something is wrong with the load. I said nothing. A man's happiness deserves a clear road, and so I filed it away the way I've always filed things, and I waited. They married 11 months later at Douglas's estate out in Alpharetta. The kind of wedding where nothing is left to chance because everything has a price tag and someone is keeping score. The toast Douglas gave was technically about Marcus and Simone, but it was really about Douglas, about legacy, about the standards the Belcourt name carried, about what it meant to join a family that had built what they'd built. He said it warmly. He smiled at all the right moments. People laughed, and people cried, and Marcus stood next to his bride looking at his father-in-law, the way a man looks at someone he genuinely respects. I watched from my seat at the third table. I drove home and wrote the date down, the first entry in a journal I kept in the top drawer of my desk for the next 14 months. Their daughter arrived just over a year into the marriage. 5 pounds 13 ounces, a full head of black hair, and her father's exact jawline from the very first hour. Marcus called me from the delivery room at 3 a.m, and his voice cracked right down the middle, cracked wide open like a seam, giving way under something too big to hold. "Dad," he said. "Dad, she's here. She's so small, Dad. I don't know what to do. She's here." I drove across Atlanta in the dark and sat outside that nursery window and looked at her for 40 minutes and didn't say a word to anyone. They named her Zara. And something settled into my son when she arrived, some long, restless part of him finally coming to rest, like a compass finding north. He read to her every night. He learned to braid her hair because Simone worked late on Thursdays. He was her father in every single way that has ever mattered. I need you to hold that sentence in your mind right now, because there will be a moment later when it is the only thing keeping the story standing. The trouble came the way it always does, not in one wave but in small, unrelated pieces that only form a pattern when you finally spread them out on a table and step back. About 9 months after Zara was born, Marcus mentioned that Douglas had offered him a new role. Not a job, exactly, more of a title. Community and stakeholder relations for the Belcourt Group, representing the family's development projects to neighborhoods, city councils, civic groups. Douglas wanted a warm face with good credibility and a public school teacher's reputation. Marcus told me the salary was nearly 4 times what the school district paid. He said Simone thought he should take it. I asked what Marcus thought. He said he was still considering it. I didn't say what I was thinking. I asked him one question. Had he seen a contract? He said Douglas's office was drawing it up. I nodded and said, "Take your time," and I smiled. And when I got home, I called my neighbor Vince. Vince Drummond has been on the other side of my back fence since before Marcus could drive. He's done family law in Atlanta for 28 years. He's not my lawyer, he's the man I've watched football with and borrowed a socket wrench from and trusted more than most people I've worked with professionally. I told him over the fence one evening what Marcus had described. Just thinking out loud, not accusing anyone of anything. Vince got quiet in the specific way he gets quiet when something concerns him. Then he said, "Gerald, was there ever actually a signed contract?" I called Marcus that same night, casual as I could manage. No contract yet. Month-to-month classified as an independent contractor arrangement. More flexible for both of us, Douglas had told him. Vince looked at me over his coffee the next morning and didn't say a word. He didn't have to. I want to stop here and say something to you directly. If you have ever sat across from someone you love and watched them walk, smiling, towards something you can see as a trap, and you knew that saying the words out loud would only make them defend the person setting it, then you know exactly the kind of loneliness I'm about to describe. You hold the whole picture in your hands. You can't show it yet, so you carry it alone. And it weighs more than anything you've ever lifted. I carried it for a long time. 5 months into the journal, Simone came to my house by herself. She'd never done that before. I made coffee, and she sat at my kitchen table in Midtown, and looked out the window for a long time before she spoke. She said, "Gerald, I need you to know that I love Marcus." I told her I knew. She said, "I love Zara more than I can even explain." I told her I knew that too. Then she looked down into her cup and said her father had certain ideas about how things should go about Zara's school, her environment, the circles she'd move in when she was older. She said those ideas and Marcus's weren't always the same. I asked her what kind of ideas. She looked up at me, and what I saw on her face was a woman standing at the edge of something she hadn't chosen and wasn't sure she was free to step back from. She said her father thought Marcus was a good man. Then she stopped. I waited. She didn't finish the sentence. She drank her coffee and left 20 minutes later and held on to me at the door longer than she ever had. I stood in my kitchen after the door closed and didn't move for a long time. That night, I made 2 calls. One to Vince. One to a private investigator named Calvin Reese, who Vince had worked with for years and called the most thorough man he'd ever hired. What Calvin found took the breath out of me. The house, Marcus and Simone lived in a 4-bedroom brick home in a good part of Decatur that I had always assumed they'd purchased together, was owned entirely by a holding company registered in Delaware that Douglas controlled. Marcus's name had never appeared on the deed. Not once. Douglas had called it a wedding gift during the engagement and simply never transferred ownership of anything. The monthly salary came through a separate LLC structured to provide maximum flexibility for the person paying it and zero legal protection for the person receiving it. In the prenuptial agreement, the one Marcus had signed before the wedding with a lawyer Douglas's office had recommended, was written in language that a family attorney Marcus had trusted, had called standard, but which Vince, reading it carefully 3 years later, called the most one-sided document he'd seen in a decade of practice. I read that prenup on a Sunday afternoon at my kitchen table. I read it twice. Then I sat back and thought about that pause before the word impressive. But that wasn't the thing that kept me awake. Calvin had spoken, in the course of his work, to a former nurse who had briefly worked at the OB clinic Simone had used during her pregnancy. The nurse had since moved to a different city and had no connection to the Belcourt family. She told Calvin that during a difficult appointment early in the third trimester, Simone had confided that she wasn't certain Marcus was Zara's biological father. I sat with that for 3 days. 3 full days of doing nothing, just holding it, walking through my house with it, sitting in my backyard with a cup of coffee that went cold while I looked at nothing. Then I did something I had never imagined doing in my life. I asked Marcus if we could put together a family health history, something Pauline and I had always meant to do and never finished. I said the heart disease on my side of the family alone was reason enough. I said I'd put together a kit, make it a project, include Zara too, so she'd have a complete picture someday. Marcus thought it was a beautiful idea. He helped me collect the samples. He had no idea that on a weekend when Zara was staying with me for what she called grandpa camp, the weekends she showed up with a backpack full of stuffed animals and asked me to tell her stories about the city. I took a separate swab and sent it to a private laboratory on its own. The results came on a Thursday. I opened the envelope at the kitchen table and read it once. Then I put it in the drawer beneath the journal and didn't touch it again for 6 weeks. Marcus was not Zara's biological father, and I want to be precise about what I did next. Nothing. I made no call, I sent no text, I gave no sign. I sat with the heaviest piece of paper I'd ever held in 31 years of professional life, and instead of reaching for a lawyer or a phone, I thought about a little girl who was almost 3 years old, who called me Granddad G, who ate exactly 1 grape at a time and lined her shoes up facing the same direction every single night before bed. I thought about what she needed, and then I started building. Let me be honest about something, because I owe you that. If that envelope had landed in your hands, if you were sitting where I was sitting, I don't know what you would have done. I don't know that I'd judge you for any of it. The human thing, the natural thing, is to feel the betrayal pour through you like hot water and act. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to pick up the phone, but I kept thinking about Zara's face, and a betrayal you broadcast in the heat of the moment can't protect anyone. So, I swallowed it for her. And I got to work. Vince helped me find Marcus a real attorney, someone in downtown Atlanta with no connection to Douglas Belcourt or the network of firms he used. A precise, quiet man named Lawrence Tate, who had a reputation for cases involving exactly this kind of financial entrapment. I paid the retainer myself out of savings I'd set aside for Marcus after Pauline died, money I'd always meant for him. We documented everything, the deed, the LLC structure, the prenup, and its hidden conflicts of interest. Calvin kept digging and located 2 former Belcourt Group employees who had been eased out of their positions using almost identical structures. I called them both. I listened for a long time. One of them, a man named Raymond, who had managed 3 Belcourt properties for nearly a decade, said something I wrote down on a legal pad and kept. "He doesn't let you go," Raymond told me. "He arranges things until you've got nowhere left to stand, until you've got no choice but to walk. Then he tells everybody you left on your own terms. And there's nothing in writing that says anything different." I thought about my son in his borrowed office, in his borrowed title, in his borrowed house, and something in me went very still and very clear. I didn't tell Marcus. Not because I didn't trust him, I trusted him completely. But I knew him. He would have called Douglas that same afternoon, face hot, hands shaking, and demanded answers. And Douglas Belcourt had been doing this long enough that his lawyers would have had a polished response waiting before dinner. I'd watched that man operate for years. He was never caught without a prepared position. So I needed him caught without one. And that meant I had to wait. Waiting, when you love someone and you can see what's coming, is the hardest kind of work there is. There is no tool for it. There is no blueprint. You just stand there and hold the structure steady while everything in you wants to act. The morning it happened was a Tuesday in late October. I was at my kitchen table with coffee when Marcus called, and his voice had gone flat in the particular way a voice goes, when a man is holding himself together through sheer controlled force of will. He said his access badge had stopped working at the office that morning. He said Douglas had called at noon and told him his engagement with the company was being concluded. He said he drove home and the garage code didn't respond, and there was already a locksmith's truck in the driveway when he got there. He said Simone had texted him, not called, texted saying things had gotten complicated and he should take some time. He said she sounded like she was reading off a card. He stopped. Then, "Zara's inside, Dad. She's with Simone. She doesn't even know anything's wrong." I closed my eyes for 2 full seconds. Then I said, "Is she safe?" He said yes. I said, "Good. You call your attorney right now." You tell him it's time, then you come here. Silence on the line. A long, quiet silence. Then, Dad. What attorney? I don't have a... His name is Lawrence Tate, I said. His number is in your phone under the letter T. I put it there 5 months ago. You call him and then you come home. Another silence. Longer this time. And then, very quietly, so quietly I almost didn't hear it. You knew. Come home, son, I said. That was all. He sat at my kitchen table for a long time when he got here. I put coffee in front of him, and I let him be quiet for as long as he needed. Outside, the neighborhood was going about its morning, a dog barking 2 houses down, a lawn service truck rumbling past on the street. Inside, my son was sitting in the same chair he'd sat in as a teenager, and doing the hard work of processing the fact that someone had been systematically dismantling his life for years while he smiled and showed up and tried. When he was ready, I sat across from him and I started at the beginning. The journal. Calvin's findings. The deed that had never changed hands. The LLC. The prenup and the attorney who'd had a 17-year relationship with Douglas Belcourt that he never once disclosed. I set the folders down one at a time and let Marcus read each one without rushing him. I watched his face move through each revelation, the slow, dawning recognition of a man seeing in documents what he had felt but never been able to name. When I had set down the last folder, I stopped. I put my hands flat on the table. I said, "There is one more thing, and I need you to hear it before you say anything." He looked at me. He nodded once. I slid the envelope across the table. And I want to slow this down for you, because this is the moment that everything, all 14 months, every note, every phone call, every hour of holding what I knew while saying nothing had been bending toward. And it deserves to be lived second by second. He looked at the envelope. He looked at me. He picked it up with hands that were not quite steady, and I could see him working to keep his face still, working the same way a structure works against wind, using its own weight to stay upright. The kitchen had gone completely quiet. I could hear the refrigerator cycling. I could hear the clock on the wall above the stove. I could hear my own pulse in my ears like a slow, deliberate count. He opened it. He read it. His eyes moved once across the page, and then again the way eyes move when they've read something and the brain refuses to admit the words, and then the color left his face. Not quickly. Slowly. The way light leaves a room when a cloud moves in front of the sun. He set the paper down with the careful deliberateness of a man who no longer fully trusts the steadiness of his own hands. Outside, a car passed on the street. Somewhere far off, a dog barked twice and stopped. Inside my kitchen, in a house I had lived in for 22 years, neither of us breathed. "She's not mine," he said. It wasn't a question. The way he said it had no question in it at all. "Biologically," I said. He looked up at me. And in 31 years of showing up for this man, driving him to school, sitting with him through his mother's death, teaching him to drive in an empty parking lot on a Sunday morning, watching him become a father himself, I have never in my life wanted to take someone's pain into my own body the way I wanted to take his in that moment. To reach across that table and absorb it so he didn't have to carry it. I said the only true thing there was to say. That is the only way in which she is not yours. In every other way that has ever mattered, she has been yours from the first hour. She is yours right now, and she will be yours tomorrow. And I am not going to let a piece of paper tell my granddaughter anything different, not if I have anything to do with it. He pressed the heels of both hands into his eyes. His shoulders moved once a single, suppressed shudder, the kind of grief that a man holds inside his ribs because he doesn't yet know it's safe to let it out. He didn't make a sound. I did not reach across the table. Some grief has to be allowed to land before a person can stand up inside it. Some weight has to settle before you know what you're actually carrying. The clock ticked. The coffee went cold in both our cups. Time stretched out the way it does at a graveside, where a single minute holds an hour's worth of weight. And then, slowly, he lowered his hands. His eyes were red and wet and completely clear. And I watched my son in real time, in my kitchen on an ordinary Tuesday in October, decide who he was going to be. Decide it consciously, deliberately. The way you decide something when the cost of it is real and the decision still holds. He said, "What do we do?" I said, "We already started. I want to be honest with you one more time here, because you deserve it. If I were sitting where my son was sitting that morning, if it were me holding that piece of paper, I don't know that I'd have found my footing that fast. I genuinely don't. I don't know if I'd have skipped the betrayal and landed on the love. But that's the thing about raising a child. You don't get to choose the test. You only get to hope that the things you poured into them over all those years are still load-bearing when the real weight arrives. His were. Every single one. Lawrence Tate filed the first documents that Friday morning. The core of it, while the work behind it was anything but simple, was actually straightforward. The Belcourt Holding Company's failure to ever transfer the house had created enforceable rights under Georgia law, a promise made, relied upon, and never honored. The LLC pay structure, with no real employment contract and no legal protections, gave Marcus a strong claim for unpaid compensation and benefits he'd been owed for years. And the prenup, reviewed now by independent counsel, had been signed under conditions that raised serious questions because the attorney Douglas recommended had represented Belcourt interests for going on 15 years and had never once mentioned that to Marcus. Douglas's lawyers responded within 48 hours. They were good. They were fast. They clearly had a version of this response prepared because Douglas had done this before and knew the exposure. What they had not prepared for was the scope of what we'd built. Calvin had spent 14 months being thorough. Raymond came forward with records he'd kept in a fireproof box in the back of his garage, and his termination mirrored Marcus's closely enough to establish a pattern. The second former employee came forward with her own documentation. And then Simone did something I will carry in the better part of my memory for the rest of my life. I will not speak harshly of Simone. She was raised by a man who spent her entire childhood making her believe that his decisions were the same thing as love. But when she finally understood the full picture, what had been done to her husband, what had been structured around her marriage without her full knowledge, what her father had arranged in her name, she made a choice that I know cost her more than anyone could see from the outside. She called Lawrence Tate's office. On her own. Without prompting. She handed over documentation, confirming the deed structure and the compensation arrangement, and she volunteered, alone, the truth about Zara's conception, a truth she had been carrying by herself for nearly 4 years. I don't know what it took for her to lift that phone. I know exactly what it meant for all of us. Here's something I owe Douglas Belcourt, even now. I don't believe he woke up every morning deciding to be a bad man. I think in the deepest part of himself, he believed he was protecting something. He had built a real thing from nothing. He had worked and sacrificed and structured an empire over 40 years. And when he looked at Marcus, at a schoolteacher who drove a 10-year-old car and coached youth soccer and didn't understand what a holding company was, he genuinely saw a weak point in a structure he'd spent his life building. He thought removing him quietly was cleaner and kinder than open confrontation. He thought he was being a responsible steward of his family's future. He thought he was protecting his daughter and his granddaughter. That's the tragedy of men like Douglas. They confuse control with love so completely and for so long that eventually they can't feel the difference anymore. And everyone around them pays the structural cost of that confusion. Understanding that didn't make me forgive him, but it made what came next feel less like revenge and more like a building being inspected honestly for the first time by someone it couldn't intimidate into silence. The settlement took just over 4 months. I won't lay out every detail, some of it is sealed and some of it no longer matters. What matters is this. The house was transferred into Marcus's name, enforcing the promise that had always existed. The compensation claims were settled, restoring what Marcus had earned and was owed, with legal fees covered. The prenup was thrown out entirely. Douglas didn't go to jail. I want to be straightforward about that. What he did was structured carefully enough to stay on the civil side of the line, and I am not naive about what money and relationships can purchase in that regard. But 2 of his largest commercial partners, once they understood the pattern laid out in the proceedings, quietly walked away from him. A development deal he'd been pursuing for 3 years collapsed in financing. The name stopped opening certain doors. I'll take that. I will take that without a moment's hesitation. Here is what this whole thing taught me, and I want you to hear it plainly. The most dangerous people in your life rarely raise their voice. They smile, they give gifts, they make themselves indispensable. They build the cage one comfortable bar at a time. And by the time you realize you're inside it, the door has been locked for years. The mistake most people make is believing that generosity never comes with conditions. It doesn't always. But when someone gives you a home, a job, a future, and their name is the only one on the paperwork, they haven't given you anything. They've given themselves a lever. What Simone understood in the end, that no one else in that family ever quite did, is that protecting your child sometimes means stepping away from the person who shaped you. That is not a small thing. That is one of the hardest things a person can do. So here is something concrete you can do today. If someone has handed you a home, a job, a partnership, a future read, the paperwork, every line of it, find your own lawyer, not theirs. Love and legally binding documentation are not the same instrument. And the people who tell you not to worry about the difference are almost always the ones counting on you not to look. And here's the question I want you to sit with after you close this. If everything you have right now were quietly held in someone else's name, your house, your income, your security, how free are you? Not how safe, how free. Zara turned 4 in January. We celebrated here, in my house, because Marcus is staying with me while he figures out what comes next. She wanted a space theme, stars and rockets and everything silver. So I spent a Saturday afternoon letting a 4-year-old explain to me with complete authority how rocket ships work, while she drew me diagrams on a paper bag, and I nodded and said, "Yes, I see, that makes perfect sense." And she looked at me like I was genuinely the smartest man she'd ever met for finally understanding. Marcus stood in the kitchen doorway watching us and working through something. Not grief, not anymore, something more like the slow, private work of accepting that a thing you thought you understood has a new shape now, and learning to love that shape instead of mourning the old one. He's doing that work, every single day. He picks Zara up and drops her off. He reads to her at night. He coaches her Saturday soccer team on a field where she spends more time picking dandelions than chasing the ball, and he cheers for her anyway, every time, without fail. He has not faltered. Not one day. People sometimes ask me when I tell this story to people who know us whether I feel guilty for letting Marcus walk through those months without knowing, for letting him sit inside a situation I could already see clearly. I don't have a clean answer. What I know is that if I had told him early, he would have confronted Douglas from raw feeling instead of from strength. He would have walked in with his heart in his hands and no documentation, and Douglas would have had a response waiting that left Marcus isolated, with no legal footing and no way out. What I built took time and silence, and the discipline to hold a plan steady, while every instinct I had screamed at me to act. Was it right to let my own son not know what I knew? I genuinely don't know. I know it was necessary. Those two things don't always sit comfortably together, but I've made peace with carrying both. Before I let you go, I read every comment on these stories, every single one, because your responses are part of why I keep telling them. So, I want to ask you something directly, and I want you to actually answer. Comment 1, if you think I did the right thing, that protecting Marcus in silence, building from the outside, was the right call, even if it meant he walked in the dark for months. Comment 2, if you believe a father owes his child the truth the moment he knows it, no matter what the strategy costs. Comment 3, if you're somewhere in between, if you're still turning it over, the way I still do some nights. And while you're down there, tell me where in the world you're watching from, and what time it is right now. I love knowing how far these stories reach. And if you have ever had someone with money or power look right through you and quietly decide that your life was theirs to arrange, tell me. You are not as alone in that as you feel. Not even close. If this story meant something to you, do me one small kindness and subscribe before you go. It's just me and a small team that cares about getting these right. Every single subscriber is what keeps this channel going. Stay a while. There are more stories coming. I'd like you to hear them. This is a fictional story inspired by real emotional experiences, fully rewritten and reimagined in Atlanta, Georgia to create original content. Any resemblance to real people or events is coincidental.